So we're looking at this viral claim about Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus supposedly giving a bunch of money to Israel. What's kind of crazy is how the story has blown up, even though some things don't quite add up.
Yeah, it's really interesting how fast information, or I guess misinformation, can spread online these days, especially with someone like Yunus. He's got a long history of activism and giving back, but he's also been caught up in legal stuff that makes him a target.
Right, and that claim that he donated, what was it, 100 crore taka to Israel. That's a crazy amount of money. The story's going viral, but the only source is like one Facebook post. That doesn't seem very reliable, does it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a red flag for sure. Just getting info from Facebook, especially with political stuff, can be super risky. You got to think about who's posting it and what their biases might be, which is hard to figure out online.
And, this story kind of feeds into existing tension and prejudices, right? I mean, Yunus is a big deal in Bangladesh. And this claim could totally exploit political divisions and even maybe stir up anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. The story really plays on existing ideas and emotions, which is a classic propaganda move to sway public opinion. It often twists the facts or uses super emotional language to create a specific narrative.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. The source says Yunus is having trouble paying his legal fees. But then, how could he donate that much to Israel? It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. That's a big sign that something's not right. Always got to look for those inconsistencies when you're checking info online. What's wild is the source actually says later on that the whole story is made up.
Hold on, so they start the rumor and then say it's fake? That's weird. Why would they do that?
It's a classic disinformation tactic. The point is to plant a seed of doubt, even if they take it back later. That initial shock, especially with a crazy headline, can have a big impact. Some folks will only remember the claim and not the correction, so the damage is already done.
So you're saying even if they say it's false later, the lie is already out there and spreading. That's kind of scary.
It is, unfortunately. It shows how hard it is to fight misinformation online. It's like a virus, changing all the time and spreading faster than we can debunk it.
And this is all happening on Facebook, which is known for its echo chambers and filter bubbles. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. People are only seeing stuff that agrees with their beliefs.
Right.
Which makes them easy targets for this kind of manipulation.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. People get stuck in these online echo chambers, and their critical thinking skills go downhill because they never see different points of view. This is exactly where misinformation thrives.
So this is bigger than just Yunus in this one story. It's about how misinformation is used as a weapon on social media, especially against powerful people who have enemies, or folks who want to see them fall. It's almost like a modern-day witch hunt.
That's a good way to put it. It shows how important it is to be careful about what we believe online. We can't just accept everything we see, especially on platforms like Facebook, which care more about getting clicks and going viral than being accurate.
It makes you think, who benefits from spreading this lie about Yunus? Is it just random internet trolls? Or is there something more organized happening here? I mean, he is involved in some pretty high-profile legal battles.
Yeah, it's possible those legal battles are a factor. Think about it. When someone's got power and influence, there are always people who want to see them taken down.
Yeah, I'm starting to see a pattern here. Discredit the person, trash their reputation, and weaken their position. It's a classic tactic. But what's really worrying is that this story isn't just about Yunus, right? It's part of a much bigger problem.
You're absolutely right. This case shows how bad misinformation is on social media. It shows how easily fake stories can gain traction and change what people think, especially when those stories tap into existing biases and exploit our tendency to believe things that fit our worldview.
And that's where things get really tricky. We all have biases, whether we know it or not, and those biases can affect how we understand information, even if that information is totally false.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But the first step is recognizing the problem and how it works. Then we can start figuring out ways to lessen its impact.
All right, so we know that blindly trusting stuff on Facebook is about as smart as, well, believing that guy who said he was the Brazilian president on Facebook. Speaking of which, let's talk about that anecdote from the source.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's funny, but it makes a serious point about how easily we believe things online without really thinking.
Exactly. But before we get into that, I think it's important to understand Yunus's legal battles and how they might be connected to this whole smear campaign. Can you tell us about that?
So Yunus has had a bunch of legal fights over the years, some coming from his work with Grameen Bank, the microfinance place he started. These fights have gotten a ton of attention, and some people even say they're politically motivated by his opponents.
So it sounds like some powerful people want to see Yunus's reputation ruined. And what better way to do that than to spread nasty rumors online, especially on a platform like Facebook, where things can go viral so easily.
Yeah, it's a powerful weapon these days, and the fact that this rumor plays into existing biases and fears makes it even more effective.
Right, it's like that saying, a lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is still putting on its shoes. In this case, the lie about Yunus is spreading like crazy online, while people trying to correct it are struggling to keep up.
It's really frustrating. That's why we got to be on guard and learn how to spot and debunk misinformation.
Okay, let's go back to that Facebook story you mentioned, the one about the guy claiming to be the Brazilian president. I think it shows how easily we can fall for misinformation, even when it sounds totally ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a funny story, but it makes a good point. Just because something gets shared a lot or seems believable at first glance doesn't mean it's true. We need to be skeptical, especially online.
Yeah, it's like we all have to be detectives in the digital world. We've got to be careful about the information we see, look for clues, and try to separate fact from fiction.
That's a great analogy. It shows how important media literacy is these days. We need to be able to evaluate sources, see if they're credible, and recognize the tricks people use to manipulate information.
You know, it's almost like we're so used to instant information online that we've forgotten how to slow down, think critically, and really understand what we're reading.
It's risky to just absorb information without thinking critically. It's easy to get caught up in online trends and stories, especially when those stories are emotional or confirm what we already believe.
Right, it's almost like we've let algorithms do our thinking for us, and we just trust whatever they show us.
And the problem is, algorithms are designed to keep us hooked, not to give us accurate or balanced information. They often show us things that trigger strong emotions, which makes us more likely to share, even if it's not true.
It's a vicious cycle. The more we interact with sensational or emotional content, the more the algorithms show us that kind of stuff, and the less likely we are to see different points of view.
That's how echo chambers get created and reinforced. We end up in these bubbles where everyone agrees with us, and anyone who disagrees is silenced or ignored. It gives us a distorted view of reality and makes it hard to have real conversations.
It just leads to more division and polarization,
Right.
and it makes it so easy for misinformation to spread unchecked. Because if everyone around you is sharing the same lie, it starts to feel like the truth, even if there's no evidence to support it.
That's why it's so important to break out of those echo chambers and expose ourselves to different perspectives, even if those perspectives make us uncomfortable or challenge what we believe.
That's hard though, right? It's human nature to stick with people and information. That supports what we already think. It's much easier to stay in our comfort zones than to actively look for information that might change our minds.
It's a challenge for sure, but it's one we have to overcome if we want to be informed and engaged citizens. It takes a conscious effort to get out of our echo chambers and consider different points of view.
So how do we do that? It's not like we can just suddenly become immune to misinformation
Yeah.
or break free from our echo chambers overnight.
It's an ongoing process, but there are steps we can take. Start by diversifying your information sources. Don't just rely on social media or one news outlet.
So basically we need to branch out, get out of our information bubbles,
Yeah.
and be open to hearing different perspectives. That makes sense. But how do we know which sources to trust? There's so much information out there, it's hard to know what's real and what's not.
That's a key question. Look for sources known for being accurate and unbiased. Fact-checking websites can be helpful, as can reputable news organizations with a solid history.
So we need to do our homework, check the sources, and don't just believe everything we see, especially online. It sounds simple, but I think a lot of us forget to do that. We're always in such a hurry to get information.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the speed of the online world. But we have to remember that not everything online is true. And even misinformation that seems harmless can have serious consequences in the real world.
Right, and this Yunus story is a good example of that. It might seem like just another online rumor, but it could hurt his reputation, undermine his work, and make an already divided society even more polarized.
It's a clear reminder of the power of misinformation and how important media literacy is in the digital age. We all have to play a role in stopping the spread of false stories and promoting a more informed and nuanced public conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about media literacy and critical thinking, but what are some practical things we can do to avoid misinformation online?
Here are a few tips. Always think about where information is coming from. Is it a reputable news organization, a real expert, or just someone sharing something they saw on Facebook? Check if it's been verified. Are other sources reporting the same thing? Have fact-checking websites debunked the claim?
Are there other sources reporting the same thing? Have fact-checking websites debunk the claim? So it's like a three-step process.
Yeah.
Check the source, verify the information,
Mm.
and then, and only then, share it if you think it's true and important. But what about those times when we're just not sure? Like, what if the information seems kind of believable, but we can't be totally certain if it's real?
That's where critical thinking is key. Ask yourself, what's the motive behind this information? Who's going to gain from its spreading? Does it just confirm my own biases?
So basically, be your own fact checker, question everything, look for inconsistencies, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper, because the truth is often more complicated than a catchy headline or a viral meme.
Exactly. And remember, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. The Yunus story, those echo chambers, media literacy, and some tips for navigating the online world. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the impact of this misinformation on Yunus.
Oh yeah, it's important to remember the human cost of these smear campaigns. They can ruin reputations, break trust, and have real consequences for people and organizations.
Especially for someone like Yunus,
Yeah.
who's dedicated his life to social justice and helping marginalized communities. It's really sad to see his legacy tarnished by these false stories.
It shows how important compassion and empathy are online. It's easy to forget that there are real people behind the headlines and viral posts. And what we say and do online can have a big impact on their lives.
That's a good point. We need to treat each other with respect and kindness,
Yeah.
even when we disagree. And we got to be careful about the potential harm that misinformation can cause.
Absolutely. And that includes being careful about what we share online, even if we don't mean to. Our clicks and shares can help spread false stories.
So before we hit that share button, let's take a second to think about the consequences. Is this information accurate? Is it fair? Is it kind?
Those are great questions to ask because at the end of the day, we all have a responsibility to make the online world a more informed, compassionate, and just place.
Well said. I
Yeah.
think that's a perfect way to wrap things up. This has been a really interesting deep dive. Thanks for being here.
It's been great, as always.
And to our listeners, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deeper.